You know, that's the thing that I was hit with to begin with. It's like, why can't the mean professor just play nice? It's like, okay, all right. So we think about that for a bit. Okay, so there's a bunch of propositions that underlie that claim. The first is that using someone's pronoun is a mark of respect. That's not true. Now, it took me a while to formulate this, because if someone comes up to you on the street and says, why do you use pronouns? It's like, you're taken aback. How the hell do you know? Why do you use he and she? Because everyone does. And that's how language works, right? You do what everyone else does. Otherwise your language wouldn't be comprehensible. So why do we use he and she? Turns out I actually don't know. Not at a deep level. So it took me like 3 weeks to think this through. First of all, my referring to you as he has zero to do with respect. It is the most perfunctory and casual form of classification possible. It seems to be predicated on the idea that indicating someone's sex is a fundamental necessity, because otherwise it wouldn't become instantiated in the language. But there's 4 billion he's and 4 billion she's, and so when I refer to you as he, I'm referring you to you as a member of a very large herd. It has nothing to do with respect. It's just casual classification, and it's basically pragmatic in its orientation. And so the idea that when I call someone he or she, it's a mark of respect, that's not true. The next issue is, well, what if someone wants to be called something different than what everyone else wants to be called? Not my problem. And first of all, if I'm going to interact with you casually, you can't impose a restriction on how I'm going to do that. Why would I bother even interacting with you then? There's billions of people out there that I could hypothetically interact with, and I don't see that you have any right whatsoever to demand from me any particular type of linguistic preferential treatment. And you certainly have no right to demand from me my respect. I don't know if you're respectable, and if you're a left-wing ideologue, the probability that you're respectable is 0. So, and then there's another issue here. It's, well, what about, yeah, but you're treading on my identity. And in the legislation, this is another pernicious element of the legislation, a very, very, very dangerous presupposition. The idea is that identity, well, we'll say gender identity to begin with, but the larger issue is identity, because gender and identity is an element of identity. So I'm just going to talk about identity. The legislation insists that your identity is subjectively defined, and only subjectively defined. It's subjectively defined to the point where it can be divorced from any underlying biological or objective reality. And it's subjectively defined to the point where it can be entirely mutable. So you can be a boy one day and a girl the next, or a boy 1 hour and a girl the next. In fact, I know that some people have taken to wearing bracelets so that their friends can tell whether they're female or male that day. And, you know, then I thought about identity. It's like, wait a minute. Psychologists have studied identity for a very long time. Identity isn't defined subjectively. That's an insane proposition. So here's what identity is, roughly speaking. There's your conception of yourself. That's not your identity. That's your theory about your identity, actually. So, but we'll leave that aside just for a moment. We'll focus on identity. Well, your subjective sense of who you are is only a tiny fragment of your identity. Your identity is a negotiated construct. It's who you present yourself as, but it's also who other people have agreed that you are. And if you're a civilized person, you negotiate that. So, you know, your family, for example, has different opinions about your identity than you do, and that often causes a substantial amount of conflict, but that doesn't make you right and them wrong. Like if they think you're being an annoying son of a bitch, they might tell you that, and it's possible that you are, even though your self-concept might not include that. And then so there's the interpersonally negotiated element of identity, which is paramount to its existence. But then there's something that's even more fundamental, more associated, I would say, with objective reality, which is that if you have a functional identity, it's a vehicle in which you travel through life. So, for example, if you're a father, which is part of identity, let's say, then you play a particular kind of social, you have a particular sort of interpersonal and social purpose. Like it's practical machinery. If you're a lawyer, if you're a doctor, if you're a professor, if you're a baker, those are all parts of your identity. And those are parts of the toolkit. They're parts of the toolkit that you use to interact with the natural and the social world. And so the idea that your identity is your subjective whim, that no one else has anything to do with it, that no one else has a right to comment on it, that it's completely divorced from biology and objective reality it is, and I'm speaking as a psychologist here, it's the philosophy of a poorly socialized 2-year-old. And the reason I'm saying that is because 2-year-olds are egocentric. They don't know how to play with other kids yet. Even 3-year-olds have trouble with that. But between 2 and 4, there's a developmental shift. And 2-year-olds who are fundamentally egocentric learn how to expand their circle of comprehension so they can take other people's viewpoints into account. And then they can start to play shared games. And when you can play shared games with others, well, then the roles that you play in those games are defined by you and others in negotiation. And then you're acceptable to your peers. You can start being socialized by your peers and you can enter general society. So most people learn that identity is not subjective between the ages of 2 and 4. And the evidence also suggests very strongly that if you don't learn that by the time you're 4, you'll never learn it ever again in your entire life, because you get thrown outside the peer groups and then you don't get socialized properly. So no, it's not a mark of respect for me to use your damn pronoun. It's a mark of your massive narcissistic power grabbing to insist and then put the full force of legislation behind the demand that I call you anything you want. And that doesn't even touch on the potential multiplication of identities far beyond they into this insane proliferation of gender identities, which is up to about 70 now, I believe, on Facebook. And then, that means we haven't even started to talk about the insane problems posed by people like otherkins who claim non-human identity. And if identity is only subjective, it's like, well, who are you to say? Maybe I'm an elf. Maybe I'm a fairy. Maybe I'm a puppy dog. Maybe I'm a bear. And I'm using those particular appellations because there are groups who are claiming exactly that. And you say, well, that's just make-believe. And they say, you have absolutely no right to say that. It's like, well, if there's no grounding underneath identity, then it's whatever you want it to be. Well, it's almost impossible to enumerate the number of ways that's wrong. And it's dangerously wrong, apart from being totalitarian. I have to address you the way you want to be addressed. Really? I do I? No. How about no? To hell with you. I'm not doing that. It has nothing to do with whether you're transsexual. I could care less whether you're transsexual, as long as you're not particularly annoying. And that's the same way I feel about everyone else. It's like, do whatever you want. I'm pretty libertarian in that regard. But don't take your identity. You don't have any right to impose your identity on other people to the point where your arguments pose a threat to the fundamental structures of Western civilization. It's like you're pushing your luck a little bit there.
You can force someone to refer to you or refrain from referring to you in different ways. I guess one issue that I'm having difficulty with is what a pronoun is. I think we'd all acknowledge that you have a right to force people to refer to you in certain ways. If a professor had a class and they had a student who insisted on calling them a girl when they were male, or calling them queer or something, or I can think of way worse words, they would say, well, that's not a pronoun. That's a derogatory label that's just meant to degrade me. But if who's to say what is a pronoun? And I'm not sure that it necessarily would change if 95 or 97 friends all insisted on sort of degrading or using that pejorative label to the person. And I think that people who are transgendered or whatever do experience when people use the wrong gender labels to them. They've experienced real prejudice. They experience it as kind of oppressive in that way. So I don't know if identity is a subject or an object, but I do know that we place important demands on one another. I don't know about nature, but I know that fundamentally, like, our society is going to work better if we respect each other, and I think history bears that out. That self-respect and allowing people's self-identification to play a role in that public aspect. We do already have limits on how people can refer to each other, and they're informed by how people want themselves to be referred to.
Okay. Well, that's a lot of questions. So, and that's, I'm not trying to be a smart aleck about that. It's just, I'm going to have to sort that out for a minute. Well, the first thing I would say is, pronouns, and I'm not a linguist, so I'm not going to be able to whip this off the top of my head, although I do know that there is a psychologist named James Pennebaker who's written a whole book on pronouns, which you might be interested in referring to, and pronouns turn out to be extraordinarily important as signifiers, but they're also part of what's called a closed linguistic category, and they don't change. And so that's something that's useful to know. But you also bring up the distinction, or the lack of distinction, or made a lack of distinction between adjectives and pronouns. And that's pretty interesting, because there's no real reason why, if you can't insist upon which pronoun I use to address you, you can't also insist on which adjective I use to address you. And there's a lot more adjectives. And so that's, because I don't see, like, if you can choose your damn pronoun, why can't you choose your adjective? Adjectives are, the words you listed as pejorative were actually not pronouns, they were adjectives. And so you can object to them. And there's no shortage of times when you use a pejorative adjective to describe someone, especially if you believe that they've misbehaved. It's like, if the person can insist upon their pronoun, why can't they insist upon their adjective? And that's another part of this problem with this multiplicative complexity, that it isn't addressed properly within the law. With regards to respect, you said, well, human civilization progresses a lot better if we respect one another, and I actually don't believe that at all. I believe that human civilization progresses and maintains itself when we respect people who've earned respect. You don't just respect everybody randomly. Well, what the hell use is respect if you just respect people randomly? It's like inflating the currency, It's like the Simpsons episode where, Bart gets a trophy because it's every child gets a trophy day. All you do is inflate the currency. Respect is actually limited to that category of people who have earned respect in some manner. So whatever you're talking about with regards to, say, common decency between people, it's not respect. And the definitions actually matter. They matter a lot. And so I hear the respect argument all the time, but you also can't force me to respect you. You might be able to force me to act like I respect you, but you can't force me to respect you. It's just not possible. You could break me, I suppose, and then perhaps I would do it, although I can't see exactly how precisely. But so there's a number of, I get your point, and I'm not trying to denigrate it in any sense. There's a complex issue here, which is, to what degree do you allow individuals to govern the conversation that's had about them in their presence or otherwise. But I would just revert back to my original argument, which is that's a negotiation. It's either a negotiation. You got 3 states. You can negotiate with someone. You can be their slave, or you can be their tyrant. And I would pick negotiation, but as far as I'm concerned, the law right now, as it's currently instantiated, is a tyrant, and it makes people into its slave, and we're going to pay for that. And it's predicated on, hypothetically, on respect and compassion. I don't buy that for a second.